I will present you the centrifuge modeling of the response of shear anchors to multidirectional loading. So this study will focus on centrifuge tests. So first, I will introduce you the principle of physical modeling in centrifuge for geotechnical engineering. So the purpose of using a centrifuge is to work on small-scale model, and we want that this small-scale model has the same behavior than the prototype. So you can see on the left the prototype. So at a depth corresponding to Z, you have the stress, and on the small-scale model, which can be n times smaller, for the same stress in the soil, so now the depth is Z on N, you will have to increase the gravity by N, the Earth's gravity, to have the same stress in the prototype than in the small scale model. So to increase the Earth's gravity, so we have to put an acceleration in the small scale model. And to have this acceleration, the facilities we use is a geotechnical centrifuge. On this picture, you have the centrifuge of the Gustave Eiffel University. It's a geotechnical centrifuge because we can put 2 tons in the basket, and these 2 tons can be spin up to 100 times the Earth's gravity. So at 100 g, the Earth's gravity, we can divide the scale of the model by 100. The radius of this beam centrifuge is 5.5 meter, and the acceleration is equal to the radius multiplied by the rotational speed square. On the next slide, you can see 2 short videos. The first one is just to give you an idea on the left of the size of the centrifuge compared to a human. So it's really big. And on the right, this is the speed of the centrifuge. So maybe there is some lagging, because you can, at 100 G, the centrifuge spin at more than 2 turns per second. So it's really fast, and you can see that the basket is now horizontal. It's no more vertical, because you have the Earth's gravity vertically, and in the direction of the arm, you have the artificial acceleration, the centrifuge acceleration, which can be 100 times higher. So why do we use this centrifuge, and why do we have to conserve the same stress state in the prototype and in the small scale model? We do it because in geotechnical engineering and in soil, we have a lot of non-linearity in the behavior of all the geomaterials. And this on this curve, you have the behavior of the geomaterial in the axis of the stress versus the deformation. And if you look at this behavior, if you look on low stress and on higher stress, you do not have the same behavior, the same deformation related to the stress. So it's important to conserve the material and to test this material at the good stress level. So if we want to use small scale model, because it's very difficult sometimes to perform tests in real on real size, so you have to use a centrifuge. So what are the advantages of physical modeling in centrifuge? Compared to in situ testing, it's normally faster, the price is cheaper. You can go until the failure because you use a small scale model, so it's not a problem. You can perform several tests with several small scale model, and you can go to the failure. You control very well your boundary condition. Here, the principal boundary condition is the soil itself, so you can recreate a soil where you can very well define the density and the property of this soil. You can perform several tests on a same configuration, and it's sometimes easier to instrument your small scale model. But if you compare to numerical modeling, it takes more time, it's more expensive, and it's maybe more difficult to reconstitute very precise sample with different layer and things like that. So it's but it gives very important and very accurate data to numerical modeling to calibrate this model. So on the bottom, you can see that in fact you have physical modeling, which give very interesting results and clear results to numerical modeling to calibrate the model. But you have also in situ testing, which is important in the loop to be sure that you have well captured the behavior of your problem. Now I will leave Ricardo present you the objectives of the study.
So Matthieu introduced you to the concepts of centrifuge modeling, and now I will illustrate you more about what we did with centrifuge modeling for this project. Our work was divided, let's say, in different tasks that were spanning from developing the experimental setup to understanding what happens when we try to reproduce the behavior of a shared anchor, which is, of course, the goal of the project. So I will show you first what the experimental setup is made of, different parts, what's the idea behind these different parts, and then Christelle Abadie will illustrate you about the results we obtained and the interpretation that we got from these tests. So yeah, again, I will talk about experimental setup. Let's look at the sketch on the left. We are talking about shared anchors for floating wind turbines. And we see this sketch where shared anchor is shared by multiple floaters. You have to think that researchers have been studying this problem for some years now, so there are some ideas, some different concepts that we can adopt. Let's say we want different layouts of turbines, so we might have different shapes in this layout. What we stick to is this hexagonal layout where one pile anchor is shared by 3 floaters. You see it in the sketch on the right. And also you have to think that you have different choices if you think about the mooring line that is attached to the anchor pile. So in our case, we studied catenary mooring lines, which is a particular type of mooring. But of course, you can have a semi-taut or taut mooring or even tension mooring, which are vertical. So of course, these will transfer differently loads to the anchor pile. In our case, since it was a catenary mooring type, we just had horizontal components of load. And you see how in the picture on the bottom right of the slide, our experimental setup is trying to mimic what is sketched on the left. So we have different mooring lines attached to the anchor pile. You see text labels indicating the different components of the experimental setup. And if we switch to the next slide, we will see more in detail. Yeah. And this is a more detailed view. Again, on the left, you have the different components. I would say the most part of them. So you have the anchor pile at the center that is equipped with optical fibers that will give a lot of information about what happens when we load the pile in terms of deformation. And so starting from this information, we can achieve more information. We will see it later. Then we have the mooring lines that, as Tanguy has showed to you earlier, are displayed at 120 degrees each other, so that we have 3 floaters attached to the anchor pile. The anchor pile, our model anchor pile, is equipped with not only optical fibers, but also displacement lasers that allows us quite simply to monitor what the displacements of the anchor are during the test. And also, I would stress about the loading system. So we have this pulleys that are making the mooring line pass through, so that we can make the load actuators that you see on the right of the slide pull the pile horizontally. So the vertical component of load that is given by the load actuators is transferred horizontally by means of the pulleys, as you see in the picture on the left. And finally, you have load cells for monitoring loads, of course. So these tests were load controlled, and a couple of cameras to monitor that everything is going all right, and capturing some pictures or some videos of the tests, which are, of course, very nice to see. Okay, we can switch the next. And here's some greater details of all these components I just mentioned to you. So we have load cells again that are screwed to the end of the arm of load actuators. So load actuators, as you see on the bottom left of this slide, are electric motors that have a screw rotating outside of the motor. And attached to the end of this arm, there is a load cell that allows us to measure loads that we apply on the pile. Then, as you saw before, mooring lines are attached to the load cell, from the load cell to the pile, and are made of some synthetic material, which is, of course, very resistant. We were able to control multiple load actuators because since we want to study shared anchors responses, we need to study multidirectional loading, which is quite new in geotechnical engineering, let's say. And so we used the MUG digital controller to control at the same time the loading that we were applying to the anchor from different actuators. And then lastly, just an image of a type of distance laser we used for double checking displacements of the pile during the test. We have performed the 3 campaigns of tests. Here you see the first one with different tests sketched with these graphs that you will see along our presentation, where basically we loaded the pile first in one direction in blue, and secondly in direction which was perpendicular in orange. And we started observing responses of the response of the soil pile system to these subsequent loads. And then we moved to a more advanced tests, which were really multi-directional. On the next slide. That were cyclic and were involving quite complicated loading path up to the modeling, the reproduction, let's say, of a realistic storm that was developed by the hydrodynamic working team. And you see pictures of the setup as well. So imagine that the arrows that you see sketched on the left are forces that are applied by the experimental setup you see in the picture on the right. Okay. Details about the pile. As Matthieu said, of course, it's a small pile, which allows us to be quite flexible in controlling the experiment. But the test is performed at 83.3 times the Earth gravity level. So this pile becomes 83.3 times longer, for example. So its dimensions become way bigger indeed, and it's quite realistic therefore. And this pile is equipped, as I said, with optical fibers. Optical fibers measure deformations along the test, and from this information and from some mechanical properties of the material the pile is composed of, we can understand plenty of information about the response of the pile in terms of bending moment and shearing forces, and finally PY curves starting from deformations measured by optical fibers. So a very precious information that we started looking at during the project. Just to show you that mooring lines are of the catenary type, so the eccentricity of load is about 0.5 d from the seafloor. And some details about the results we can infer from optical fibers. These are profiles of deformation of the pile along during a loading case scenario. So we loaded the pile in the direction the blue arrow is showing, and progressively we observe greater deformations that mean greater solicitations on the pile. And we can, starting from these data, which are very detailed and very precise, we can infer plenty of information on what happens on the whole profile of the pile, because we have 10 sensors along the shaft of the pile from the seafloor to the tip of the pile. Yeah. And lastly, some details about how we organize the container. So the container where we perform the tests, you see here on the right, we used a clean sand that we made rain inside the container, and then we saturated the container of sand. It's a Fontainebleau sand, which is pretty common in science, in scientific works, geotechnical works. And we organized the container so that we didn't have any boundary effect. We could install multiple piles. So we installed up to 6 piles along the campaign. Here you see 4. And yeah, we just took account of boundary condition effects and possible interaction between piles. We don't want that. We just want that piles are installed in virgin locations. And yeah, those are some details about how we performed the experiment. But now results, some preliminary results will come, and Christelle Abadie will show you more about it.
Thank you, Ricardo. So I'll continue with the key results we got from that experimental campaign. And we're not going to present all the tests because there's quite a lot, but we're going to try and explain the philosophy of the tests and what we're trying to find. And to understand that and understand why we picked those specific tests, we first need to start with what is a failure mechanism around a laterally loaded pile. If you load a pile laterally, what's happening is that you have a wedge mechanism that forms at the top of the pile. And the shorter your pile is, the bigger this wedge mechanism is, and therefore the most important it is in your soil response along the pile. Following this, you're going to have a flow around mechanism. Not yet. So following this, you're going to have a flow around mechanism that's just underneath the wedge mechanism, and then a toe kick that's going to create the base shear. And the longer your pile is, the more important those two mechanisms become. Now, because we have an intermediate pile, the flow around mechanism is not that important, and the wedge mechanism and possibly the base shear become really important. Now, if you are whacking your pile in one direction, as shown on the top diagram, this wedge mechanism, you've got to see it in 3D. And the boundary of the wedge mechanism is going to be very much dictated by the angle of friction of your sand, which is around 30 degrees, a little bit more than 30 degrees. Now, if you're loading the pile in a second direction, then you're going to have another wedge mechanism that's going to form. If this loading direction is greater than 15 degrees, then these two wedges have no reasons to interact with each other, and you would expect independent responses and therefore similar responses. But if this angle is smaller, as shown on the next slide, then those two wedge mechanisms are going to interact with each other. Now, the reasoning behind our first test campaign was to do simple monotonic tests, but with different angles of variation to study this interaction between the two wedge mechanisms. And this is a test campaign we performed. On the next slide, please. Yeah, here we go. So what we did is we did what we call sun types loading paths, where we vary the angle of reloading by different values, starting with 30 degrees and then varying to 60 degrees, 90 degree, and 120 degree. And this is to see the impact of this reloading direction. So in the first case, we're bang on the same diagram as I showed on the left-hand side. So we should expect some full coupling between the two directions. But then 60 degrees is just at the limit, so we don't really know what to expect. 90 degrees should be fully recoupled. And then 120 degrees is a bit of a weird cookie, because you see that gap that's forming on the other side, on the left-hand side diagram. That means that the sand on the other side is less dense, or is becoming looser. And that has an influence, a direct influence onto your pile response. So 120 degrees is also quite interesting to study, because you might expect a softer response. And that's the reasoning behind those four choices. On the next slide, you will see the response of the pile as measured in the centrifuge. It takes a little bit of time to load. Here we go. And by pile response, I mean the top of the pile, the displacement of the top of the pile. Now, there are a lot of stuff that we can see from this figure, and we will in the future go into a lot of details of the analysis of those graphs. But in a nutshell, we're seeing very high irreversible pile displacement. If you look at the response of the pile at 90 degrees, you'll see that the extreme point are on the exact same circle, which is what we were expecting to prove the decoupling between the two directions. So our hypothesis was correct. And there is a non-collinearity between the load and the displacement. That means that if you look at the diagram from the right-hand side and the diagram from the left-hand side for each of the four cases, they don't look the same. And that's purely because of the response of the soil. So from then on, it's really interesting to go and have a look at what the fiber optics is telling us and what information this is providing. And I don't have the time to show this now, and we haven't gone to the full analysis of this, but this is how you build your models for industry practice based on those data. So very, very interesting results. So that gives you a flavor of the first test campaign on monotonic multidirectional loading of the pile. Then we expand those conclusions to multidirectional cyclic loading. And for this, we did a test program in 4 phases. And the 4 tests that were selected were one benchmark test, that's unidirectional cyclic loading. That's absolutely necessary to have one test to compare against, but also to check that the results match with published literature and validate our taste campaign. And then we have selected 4 tests that are roughly following the same loading pattern as for the cyclic loading tests, but are a different type of multidirectional cyclic loading. So we have a fan test where instead of loading in the same direction, we vary the angle in the same principle as for the monotonic multidirectional tests. Then we have a cross test, which is very important for offshore design, which corresponds to one maintained load that could be your wind, and then a wave in the perpendicular direction. And then a circle test, and this is purely an imagination of the mind, but by doing a circle instead of a cross, you maintain your load amplitude the whole way through and only vary the angle. So it's quite interesting to do it to understand fully the properties of multidirectionality in the cyclic loading. So that's why those 4 tests were chosen. I don't have the time to show you all the results from all those tests, so I'm going to show the results of the unidirectional cyclic test so that you've got an idea of what to expect as a result. And then we'll do a focus on the cross test. Can you switch to the next slide, please? Okay, super. So in this test program, the objective is simple. It's just to have a benchmark test to compare against. It's also been used in another study that's done in parallel of the centrifuge tests, which is numerical, and it's used for validation and calibration, so it's quite important. And it's used to compare the future multidirectional cyclic tests. And in here, we do a load sequence, which consists of 1,000 cycles of a small amplitude, which is 20% of the maximum load that's expected on the foundation. And we do that repeatedly. This corresponds to your operational load. And then we do 100 cycle packet at 60% of this maximum load. This corresponds to a big storm. And then we do 10 cycles at the maximum load. We would expect only 1 at this level, but since we're at it, we can do 10 and get more data. And then we really bring the pile to failure by exceeding that load and going to 20% more than this load. And that's the test we do. And then this is the pile response, so the pile head displacement that we get at the top. And what you can see is some progressive ratcheting. Ratcheting is the accumulation of permanent displacement at the top of the pile over the time. And you can see that this is quite small for the 20% load packet, and then a lot bigger and more pronounced at 60%, really big for 100% and really, really big for 120%. And by analyzing in detail those results, we can see that this conforms quite nicely with published literature and other tests that have been done before on similar piles. So this is all good and validates our test setup. Now, onto the cross test. So in this test, what we do is we load at 20% of the maximum load, and we then load cyclically in the perpendicular direction for 1,008 cycles. And the amplitude of that load that you see in the perpendicular direction is chosen so that the opening of the cone is 45 degrees on either side, so 90 degrees total. And then we do it again at 60%, and then we do it again at 100%. So on the next slide, you'll see the load sequence that we actually sent. So we couldn't go all the way to the end of the test because we lost the control on one of the actuator, which is quite spectacular. But the initial results, even with 25 cycle at 60%, are really, really interesting. And what we want to study here is that if you were doing two-way loading without that maintained load in the perpendicular direction, you wouldn't expect a large accumulation of displacement. Equally, if you maintain that load without loading cyclically, you would expect a little bit of creep, but it wouldn't be very significant accumulation of displacement. If the two directions are fully uncoupled, then your pile shouldn't move. But what we see, which is shown on the next slide, is that the pile actually accumulates a lot of displacement in the almost perpendicular direction. So what do we see on this diagram, which is, again, the pile head displacement over cycle number? At 20% of the maximum load, not much is happening. But at 60%, the pile moves a lot in the perpendicular direction, which is the direction of the maintained load, which was not expected if you didn't have any coupling between the two directions. And that coupling comes from the sand response, which is really interesting. The other thing that's interesting is that the pile displacement is not collinear to the load that's applied to it. It's slightly going in the direction of the first load direction. That means that you see that we load first up and the pile goes more up than goes down on the diagram. So that's the two interesting conclusions from that test. On the next slide, so once we finished this test campaign, we did one final cyclic multidirectional test, which consisted in comparing the numerical analysis, fully calibrated and validated, which unfortunately we can't present today because that group is not present, but to our experimental results. And for this, what we did is we took one of the real cases that Tanguy presented earlier, with a storm that corresponds to an HS of 11 meter, TP of 13 second, UW of 40 meter per second, and UC of 1 meter per second, which is given on the left-hand side diagram. We rotated that so that it corresponds to our lines in the way that I've shown you in the previous slides, which gives you the middle diagram, and that's the force diagram that we applied. We implemented that onto our actuators and measured the pile displacement, which is on the right-hand side. Now that's pretty spectacular because that had never been done before, to send this type of loading sequence onto a centrifuge experiment on a pile. So that was quite exciting. And what you can see on the diagram on the right-hand side is this misalignment that we saw on the more simplified load cases before. We observe it again, and we observe that same ratcheting progression of the pile as we observed before in the simplified load sequence. So what does that tell you? Is that our simplified load sequence are pertinent and relevant to understand the pile behavior properly and in a rigorous way. And the conclusions also pertain to more complicated load sequence that may not be as tidy as what we have in the previous cases. And now in the next slide, I show you the comparison that with the numerical analysis. So in green, instead of the blue from before, is the experimental centrifuge data. And in dark blue is the results from the numerical analysis. So the numerical analysis is conservative compared to the experimental data that we obtained. That was a choice of calibration that was deliberate from the beginning. But what's really interesting is that we get the same type of behavior. We obtain the same misalignment compared to the principal direction of the load, and we obtain that ratcheting value. So overall, it's a fairly satisfying numerical modeling and a promising first comparison between the numerical model and the experimental data during a storm event that's fairly complicated. And further comparison with more simplified cases that I've shown in point 2 and point 3 will come and enable to refine this numerical model in the future. All the data that we've obtained during this experimental campaign have been compiled and provided into an experimental database for future validation of numerical models. It's fairly boring, so I'm not presenting that here. But in conclusion to this presentation, we've shown you a new test setup that's been rigorously validated. I didn't show this part of the experimental campaign, but we spent an entire container making sure that the test setup is rigorous, and this is going to be published in a journal paper. This setup enables to perform multidirectional loading tests that have shown a non-collinearity between the load and the displacement increment, an accumulation of resultant displacement that is highest for unidirectional loading and then second highest for 30 degrees angle, and then lower and lower as you increase the angle. This was followed by a cyclic loading multidirectional campaign. The unidirectional cyclic test is consistent with published literature. And on the cross tests, we observe an accumulation of displacement in the principal direction that is significantly large and would not exist if there was an uncoupling between the two principal directions. So that's a very interesting result. And there is almost no displacement in the loading direction, which is consistent with most common observation on two-way cyclic loading on pipes. We then applied those findings to a more complicated storm event, and the finding coincide with what was found for the cyclic multidirectional loading tests, and compared them to numerical values. And what this shows is that the numerical model accumulates permanent deformation in the same way that the experiment do, and provides a strong first base for future development of numerical models. And this is all gathered into a database. Thank you very much. Oh yeah, before I close this out, this is a technical team that performed the tests with us, and none of this work would be possible without them, so I want to thank them here. And if you have any further interest in the research that we are doing, in the next slide I've listed all the publications that we've made of this work. In particular, Tanguy, if you can show the next slide. In particular, there are currently one paper that's published, which is the ECPMG conference paper that you can download, that explains the setup of this work, and the ISFOC paper, which will soon be published, that summarizes the cross data results. Thank you.